He was the first to betray him and the last to make that mistake. His end didn't come with a gunshot, but with the soft sound of papers being arranged on a table. This is the story of the moment a brilliant man realized he had been surpassed by the master of Harlem. In the autumn of 1936, Harlem was a kingdom in the making, emerging from the ashes of a brutal war. The notorious mobster Dutch Schultz, who had attempted to colonize Harlem's lucrative numbers game with psychopathic violence, was dead. In the power vacuum, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson emerged as the unifying force. But peace was fragile, and the task ahead was monumental, transforming a chaotic ecosystem of hundreds of independent numbers, bankers, into a single cohesive empire. Trust was the most valuable and rare currency. It was at this crucial moment that Reggie Numbers Thorne, a brilliant but bitter accountant, decided to test the authority of his new king. Bumpy had plucked Reggie from obscurity and placed him at the financial heart of his nascent empire. Reggie, who had seen rivers of money flow through his hands, became convinced that he was smarter than the warring king who employed him. He developed a double ledger system and began to embezzle a small percentage. Reggie's fatal mistake wasn't greed, but intellectual arrogance. He believed Bumpy was just a man of muscles, incapable of understanding his art. The historical context of the late 1930s was one of precarious reconstruction. The Great Depression still cast its long shadow over Harlem. The numbers game wasn't just an addiction, it was a mechanism for economic survival for the entire community. Bumpy Johnson, with the tacit support of Lucky Luciano, was tasked with transforming this artisanal industry into a criminal corporation. This required creating systems, imposing rules, and above all, ensuring that the system was fair. His men needed to believe that loyalty would be rewarded. Reggie Thorne's betrayal, coming from the epicenter of the operation, was therefore not just a robbery. It was a direct attack on the foundation of Bumpy's new kingdom, an existential threat to his newly acquired authority. If word spread that the king could be deceived by his own treasurers, trust would evaporate, and the empire would disintegrate into chaos before it was even fully formed, proving to everyone that Bumpy was no different from the weak bosses who preceded him. Bumpy Johnson's psychological persona at that time was that of a nation builder, a legislator for a lawless kingdom. He was a visionary who saw the potential for a unified Harlem. His mind, sharpened by years of solitary reading in prison and countless chess games, was his primary tool of governance. He was obsessively meticulous. Unlike the stereotype of the impulsive gangster, Bumpy spent hours every night personally analyzing books, daily reports from each district, betting patterns. He had a photographic memory for numbers and an almost supernatural intuition for anomalies. His lieutenants often mistook this attention to detail for paranoia, but in reality, it was strategic discipline. He had studied the fall of empires and knew that they rarely fall because of external attacks. They rot from the inside out. The betrayal of a trusted man like Reggie was his greatest fear, and the challenge he knew he needed to face so decisively that the lesson would never be forgotten. Bumpy's moral code valued loyalty above all other virtues. He could forgive mistakes but not deliberate betrayal. For Bumpy, loyalty was a sacred pact. He offered his men protection, opportunity, and a fair share of the profits. In return, he demanded absolute loyalty. Breaking that pact was the ultimate sin. Reggie Thorne was no stranger. He was someone Bumpy had elevated, someone he had trusted. Reggie's betrayal was therefore deeply personal, an act of ingratitude that violated the most fundamental code in Bumpy's universe. The response couldn't be merely punitive. It had to be a statement, one that established the sanctity of loyalty as the first and most important commandment of his new kingdom. He needed to prove that his authority extended not only to the streets, but also to the spreadsheets and accounting books, a domain where many assumed he was ignorant. Bumpy's strategy shone through in its methodical approach. He didn't confront Reggie the moment he felt the first suspicion. Instead, he began his own secret investigation, a phantom audit. For weeks, he operated on two levels. Publicly, he treated Reggie with the same confidence. Privately, he began cross-referencing the numbers in Reggie's books with the raw reports from his most trusted district controllers. He pieced together a complex puzzle, piece by piece, comparing the stated totals with the actual revenues. It was an exhausting exercise in patience and intellectual rigor, carried out in the quiet hours of the early morning. Bumpy was hunting in his own house, using his mind as a weapon to track prey that had no idea it was being hunted. This approach was the hallmark of his genius, transforming forensic accounting into a predatory art form, waiting for the moment when the evidence was so overwhelming that denial would be impossible. Bumpy's reputation as the new king of Harlem was at stake. He had promised his men and the community a new era of order and justice. If he couldn't police his own house, that promise would be empty. The story of how he dealt with his first major internal betrayal would become a founding legend of his reign. It had to be a story that inspired loyalty through a potent mixture of respect for his intelligence and fear of his retribution. The punishment had to be so unique and symbolic that no one would ever dream of repeating Reggie's mistake. Bumpy knew he wasn't just dealing with a dishonest accountant, he was drafting the constitution of his empire. And the first amendment to that constitution would be simple and brutal. Treason is punished with oblivion, and the king's intelligence is absolute and omnipresent. Reggie Thorne's fatal mistake was intellectual underestimation. He looked at Bumpy and saw an ex-convict, a man of the streets, and assumed that his own education and skill with numbers made him superior. He couldn't conceive that Bumpy, a man without accounting training, could decipher his sophisticated scheme. Reggie committed the sin of arrogance, believing Bumpy's intelligence was a myth. He didn't understand that Bumpy's intelligence didn't come from books, but from survival. Bumpy had a PhD in human nature. He knew that greed leaves a trail and that arrogance always makes mistakes. Reggie, in his blind confidence, became careless, letting small discrepancies that to the untrained eye were nothing, but to Bumpy were the loose thread that would unravel his entire plan. He thought numbers were his fortress, not realizing that for Bumpy, numbers were merely windows into the souls of men. The trap for Reggie wasn't a dark alley, but a silent accounting room. Bumpy summoned him to a late-night meeting in the operations main office, a small room in the back of a funeral home that served as its headquarters. The pretext was to review the financial projections for the coming year. The atmosphere was sterile and silent, lit only by the bright light of a single desk lamp. On the large mahogany table, instead of future projections, Bumpy had spread out side by side the two versions of the accounting books, the falsified books that Reggie presented to him and the real books that Bumpy himself had meticulously reconstructed. There were no armed men, no threats. The weapon this night was the naked truth. The confrontation was purely intellectual, which made it infinitely more terrifying for Reggie. Bumpy invited him to sit down and with deadly calm began his presentation, not as a prosecutor but as a disappointed professor. The irreversibility of the moment set in when Bumpy reached the last page and looked at Reggie. There was no anger in his eyes, only a cold, cutting disappointment. "You underestimated me, Reggie," Bumpy said, his voice a whisper that was louder than a shout. "You thought I was just another street thug who couldn't read. But I read everything. I read every penny you stole. And most importantly, I read you." Reggie completely crumbled. Sweat dripped down his forehead, staining his starched collar. His brilliant mind, which he considered his greatest weapon, had been cornered, outwitted, and humiliated. He was intellectually naked, his betrayal dissected and exposed under the cold light of the lamp. The tension in the room was unbearable, a heavy silence that was the sound of a man being erased from existence. There would be no negotiation, no appeal, no second chance. Reggie had committed the only unforgivable sin. Reggie's arrogance was his downfall. He saw himself not as an employee, but as a silent partner, the true brains behind Bumpy's brute force, and felt he deserved a larger share of the spoils. This self-importance prevented him from seeing the existential danger of his actions. He wasn't stealing from a faceless organization. He was personally stealing from Bumpy Johnson, a man who considered loyalty an extension of his own body. Betrayal wasn't a debt on the books. It was a cut to his flesh, an insult to his intelligence and authority. Reggie, in his bubble of intellectual superiority, failed to grasp the primal and visceral nature of power and loyalty in the world he had entered. He thought it was a numbers game, but for Bumpy, It was a game of souls, and he had just lost his definitively. The enclosed office at the back of the funeral home had become a chamber of psychological torture. Every scrap of paper on the desk was irrefutable proof of Reggie's guilt. Each calculated pause in Bumpy's calm, methodical speech was an eternity of agony. Reggie was forced to confront not only the overwhelming evidence of his crime, but the magnitude of his own stupidity. He hadn't been caught by an informant or a stroke of luck. He had been caught and outwitted by the superior mind of the man he had scorned and underestimated. This intellectual humiliation was, in many ways, a worse punishment than any physical violence that might have followed. Bumpy wasn't just punishing a thief, he was methodically destroying the ego and soul of a man who considered himself untouchable, proving that his mind was the most dangerous territory of all. The turning point was Bumpy's silence after he finished his presentation. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He simply leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, and watched Reggie disintegrate under the weight of his own guilt and terror. It was in that silence that Bumpy's control became absolute. He gave Reggie space to contemplate the abyss he had opened for himself. Power, Bumpy knew, wasn't in throwing a punch, but in forcing a man to confront the totality of his mistake and the inevitability of its consequences. When Reggie finally broke the silence and began to plead, to cry, to offer to return every penny, Bumpy simply exhaled the smoke slowly and shook his head. "It's not about the money, Reggie. It never was. It's about the trust." In that moment, in the silence of that office, Reggie Thorne realized his fatal mistake and knew it was too late. The game was over. The direct consequence of Reggie's mistake was his disappearance. He left that accounting room that night, escorted by two of Bumpy's most silent men, and was never seen by mortal eyes again. Like others who would cross fatal lines in the future, he was simply erased. His family received a generous, anonymous pension with the explanation that Reggie had accepted a job offer on the West Coast and had to leave in a hurry. Bumpy ensured they were taken care of, a gesture that was both a demonstration of his strange compassion and a chilling warning to all others. He controlled not only life and death, but also the well-being of those traitors left behind. The strategic consequence was the establishment of a culture of absolute loyalty that became the backbone of Bumpy's empire. The message that cemented Bumpy's untouchability was the chess piece. The day after Reggie's disappearance, employees arriving at the office found perfectly centered on Reggie's empty desk a single chess piece from an expensive alabaster set, a pawn carved from red stone. The message was unmistakable and multifaceted. Red for the color of blood and debt, and a pawn because Reggie, who considered himself an important player, was in the end just a disposable piece in Bumpy's grand game. The symbol became more powerful than any act of violence. It was the representation of Bumpy's omniscience and relentless justice. He no longer needed to erase men, he only needed to remind them that he could, and the symbol did the work for him. He had reached the pinnacle of power, the ability to control others through ideas. The historical impact of that event manifested most clearly in the unprecedented stability of Bumpy Johnson's empire. While rival criminal organizations were routinely undermined by internal disputes, paranoia, and cycles of betrayal, Bumpy's structure operated with mechanical precision, often compared to a Swiss watch. Every role was defined, every responsibility understood, and every deviation anticipated. This internal cohesion was not accidental. It was enforced by memory. The ghost of Reggie Thorne lingered within the organization as a silent regulator of behavior. His disappearance was never debated, only remembered. That memory eliminated uncertainty, which is the root of most internal collapse. As a result, Bumpy was liberated from constant internal policing and suspicion. He did not need to watch his own men obsessively, because they watched themselves. This stability allowed him to redirect his energy outward toward managing alliances, neutralizing external threats, and expanding his influence across Harlem and beyond. In an environment defined by chaos, order became his greatest advantage. Stability was not merely a byproduct of power, it was its most valuable expression. and that stability traced directly back to one decisive moment that permanently reshaped the organization's internal psychology. The lesson of the red pawn became the foundation upon which all of Bumpy Johnson's future success was built. That single symbolic act marked the transition from something fragile and improvised into something enduring and institutional. Before it, the organization resembled many others, dependent on personalities, vulnerable to greed, and constantly at risk of fracture. After it, the structure evolved into something closer to a corporation than a street gang. Rules replaced impulse, loyalty replaced opportunism, discipline replaced chaos. What had once been a loose collection of criminals became a unified force bound by shared understanding. In this transformation, the red pawn functioned as both a warning and a guarantee. It assured partners and rivals alike that Bumpy's internal operations were secure, predictable, and incorruptible. It also ensured that those within the organization understood the cost of disloyalty without requiring constant reminders. In this sense, the pawn became a seal of quality and terror, certifying the integrity of Bumpy's kingdom. It was not merely a symbol of punishment, but of reliability. And reliability, in that world, was more valuable than fear alone. Over time, the red pawn transcended its original context and became a founding myth, one that outlived the man himself. Myths endure because they explain order. This one explained why betrayal was rare, why operations ran smoothly, and why Bumpy's empire expanded while others collapsed inward. The story did not need embellishment. Its simplicity made it powerful. A man broke trust. A symbol appeared. Order followed. That narrative was repeated internally not as propaganda, but as explanation. New members absorbed it as part of the organization's identity, learning immediately that they were entering a system governed by principles rather than improvisation. The pawn represented inevitability. It suggested that consequences were not emotional reactions, but structural responses. This framing removed hope of negotiation after betrayal, which is often what fuels repeated internal crimes. By eliminating that hope, Bumpy eliminated the behavior itself. His kingdom became resilient not because it was merciless, but because it was clear. In environments where ambiguity breeds exploitation, clarity creates loyalty. That clarity, embodied in a single red piece of stone, became immortal. The story of Reggie Thorne stands as a testament to the power of intelligence and symbolism in maintaining authority. It is not at its core a story about theft or greed. It is about the violation of a sacred pact at the most vulnerable stage of a growing empire. Early kingdoms fall not to enemies, but to internal fractures. Bumpy Johnson understood this instinctively. His response to Reggie's betrayal was brilliant precisely because it addressed the true threat: erosion of trust. Rather than react with excessive violence or public spectacle, he responded with meaning. He turned punishment into narrative and discipline into culture. In doing so, he taught his world that the greatest danger never comes from outside forces, but from unchecked ambition within. Loyalty was not framed as a moral virtue, but as an existential requirement. To exist within the organization was to accept that pact fully. There were no partial commitments, no temporary exceptions. This uncompromising clarity fortified the structure from its core outward, making it resistant to decay. Perhaps Bumpy Johnson's greatest achievement as a leader was not the punishment of Reggie Thorne, but the order that emerged afterward. He created a rule so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the collective psyche of his empire, that it never needed to be applied again in the same way. Punishment became unnecessary because the conditions that required it had been eliminated. This is the highest form of control, a system that governs itself. Bumpy understood that enduring power does not rely on constant enforcement, but on internalized boundaries. His empire functioned not because everyone feared him daily, but because they understood the system completely. That understanding replaced chaos with discipline and ambition with loyalty. This lesson transcends the underworld. In any structure where trust is the true currency, whether criminal, corporate, or political, the same principle applies. Power is most stable when rules are unquestionable and meaning is shared. The red pawn remains a symbol of that truth, that the strongest kingdoms are not held together by force, but by the certainty that betrayal has no place to exist.